after, it was so thrilling. It was so fabulous that we were just overcome, and the crowd is thinning out a little bit, and we're talking about it, and these people joined us talking, and one of them said, well, it would have been all right, except it got so terrible at the end. Now, she wasn't talking about terrible because the Nazis were starting to take over. She was talking about terrible because it ruined the beauty of the show, the harmony of the show. She says, I really didn't like the last act because, I mean, it got too serious. You've never seen Cabaret?
We'll watch it. It's
We
so
have the DVD.
I have it too.
And we have watched it. We used to put it on every New Year's Eve in Toledo.
That's a weird
And it would just run. We would have people in the house all night, and it would just run all the time, and you would go in and out.
But it's one of my favorite.
It's one of the
all-time
greatest
musicals.
movies ever made.
It's incredible.
Arthur Scherbold was also German, and he did more for me than anybody.
But this isn't she asked about anti-Semitism. You're
Yeah,
saying
I'm
No,
saying
but
it.
this
Yeah.
is interesting
Yeah.
to me too.
Yeah.
It's
I
fine.
have a different question that's kind of similar. What's your best advice from both of you on how to deal with someone who's just mean? Who's just mean or rude?
For me, walk away. Don't give him a chance to say another word. Just make it obvious that you will not listen, and you will walk away. That's my advice.
I agree with that. I just don't try to answer it, but I also find that I do not suffer fools patiently, and so sometimes it's not meanness, but it's such foolish thinking that I can only take so much of it, and then I just get very impatient and walk away.
I have one other thing to say on that. It's not necessarily permanent. People do change, and if that person were to come to you and say, I was such a stupid ass in those days, and I'd really like to be your friend, I think you charitably should be willing to, if you can, to engage in conversation and hear him out. I had a resident that I hated with a passion because he worked me day and night and he would yell at us, criticize, and da-da-da. And we found ourselves in a meeting many years later in Pittsburgh. And I smiled and I said, Bob, I want to tell you a story. And I told him how angry I was. And he listened and we talked it out. And he was very appreciative to no one had ever told him. And we became good friends.
Mm-hmm.
Don't remember Bob's last name.
I had two questions. I'm trying to remember what they both. Oh, okay. One's for Papa and one's for Grandma. The one for Papa is, I'm interested in hearing about how you got into rheumatology.
Oh, interesting. When you're a freshman in medical school, you spend much of your time dissecting a body. It is a body that is donated for the purposes of teaching anatomy. This was an elderly lady that had died. When I dissected her hip was the worst joint full of arthritis I'd ever seen. And I thought, what better field is there than this to try to prevent this kind of damage. There was no such thing as surgery for a bad hip. You got a crutch or a walker or a wheelchair, and there was nothing to be done. And most people with a bad hip were young. They were not old. But it was because of that experience in anatomy that I wanted to become a rheumatologist. And it so happened that there was a Jewish rheumatologist teaching the first year medical students at St. Louis U, and I latched onto him for the whole year.
Cool. Cool. And then, so my question for Grandma is, Papa's talked a lot about really good teachers that he's had, and I was wondering if you could talk about really great teachers you've had, either inside or outside of school.
I think that's something I missed in my life. The teachers in New Madrid were actually better teachers than the ones in Memphis. When I moved to Memphis at age 14 into the 9th grade, I took Latin, and the Latin teacher was very, very hard, and probably one of the best teachers I had. And my high school English teacher was a tyrant, and everybody hated her. And if anybody said something wrong, her face would start flushing from the neck up, and her whole face would get bright red. So, you know, we were terrified of her. She was the best teacher I had, and she's the one I remember. Another one was my botany teacher in the 10th grade, because she brought in a medical technologist who took little drops of blood from somebody, and we could look at that in a microscope. Well, that changed my life, because I was just so entranced by looking at those blood cells through the microscope that I decided I wanted to be a medical technologist.
And you did finish your degree.
Yes,
Right.
I finished my degree, and then I went to Barnes Hospital, and it was a 12-month course for medical technology. And I'm still fascinated by biology. If you cut a tulip horizontally after the bulb after it's finished blooming, the symmetry of those seeds that are around and the beauty of that, it's just striking to me.
It's also mathematics.
I like
Fibonacci.
Okay.
Fibonacci.
What was-
Fibonacci is a number pattern that
Oh,
comes up a
yes,
lot in
yes.
nature.
Oh, yes.
So I
Okay.
have a-
Wait, Evie has a question.
Can I change my position?
Okay,
Yes.
I have a question. Living in the South, Grandma, what restrictions were placed on you because you are a woman?
The same as everybody my age. I went to the University of Illinois. Our first week was all tests, all week long. And they were going to help us get in the right courses and so forth. And the last day, then you met with an advisor, and it was for about, I don't know, 20 minutes or something. It wasn't a great session, but he looked at my record and he said, "Oh, you should be in pre-med." Well, my jaw dropped, because I had never thought about being a doctor or being in pre-med. I didn't really realize that there were a lot of other things you could be if you were in pre-med. But I thought, oh my goodness, I will have to talk to my parents about that. And I called home and I told my parents what I had learned. And my mother said, quote, "Well, you can do whatever you want, but don't you think medicine is a terrible field for a woman?"
Really?
And I give her all the credit for saying that I could do it if I wanted to.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I really went with the other half, and that was that would be a terrible life for a woman. So that was, I think, a restriction that I just felt because of the time that I grew up and so
So
forth.
then what?
But was that particular to the South, or was
I
that
don't
just
think
all
so. I
pervasive?
think it was feminist. I think it was, no, it was all over.
Okay.
So then, what jobs did you have after that?
When we came home, I worked as a medical technologist in Las Vegas, and when we came home, I first thing I volunteered for was the Social Action Committee of the Temple Sisterhood, and I got a call one day from one of the ladies who knew I had just moved into town. She was in Hadassah. And she says, we've got a Hadassah Bowling League and we'd like you to join it. And first of all, I had never bowled much, so I wasn't, I says, well, I don't know much.
Yeah.
Oh, that's all right, Irma, that's all right, you'll be fine. And something told me not to make a commitment that would tie up my time, like every week at 10 o'clock on da-da-da. I don't know what told me that, but it was one of the most important decisions I made, because then I was free to do whatever I wanted to do. And the next thing I did was very shortly after that, there was a rally at the University of Toledo campus against the Vietnam War.
Oh.
And one of the people who was very active in the movement against the war was our Rabbi Foyer from the temple that we belong to. So I go to this rally, and he's one of the speakers, and he must have seen me in the group, because a week or so later, I get a call from someone downtown that they were forming an advisory board for the War on Poverty, and this was under Lyndon Johnson, and they were getting community action agencies in towns to deal with poverty on a whole, like a war against, a whole new level. And they asked me, they said, our committees are 1/3 elected people, 1/3 public people, and 1/3 or people who are represent different groups, and then people who are the poor. So every committee and board was constituted that way. Well, Rabbi Foyer had been asked for Jewish representation, to suggest someone who would represent the Jewish community on that board. And he told me, he says, I know there's some people who've been working in social action longer and so forth. He says, but I think you'd be good for this. So I did it, and it was fabulous for me, and I loved it, and I did a good job, and I was elected to, offices and so forth. And then from there, the mayor put me on the Board of Community Relations, which dealt with race relations. And that, I think, is when I got out into the farmland with the migrants. So not too long ago, I had to come up with a resume for somebody. And everything I did was as a volunteer. But I also saw that everything I did was related to issues of social justice. So, and then I started, they asked me to plan a program for the Holocaust Memorial that an artist had been commissioned 5 years earlier to come up with a sculpture. And I started planning the program, and I said, you can't just dedicate this memorial, you've got to have a resource center. So I went to the board of the Federation, and I got some money, and I bought some books, and I started a whole